Welcome back, young scholars. This is the second video on the Mongols. That video just featured two of my favorite Mongolian cultural practices, eagle hunting and Mongolian throat singing. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video. What were similar about Mongol rule in China, Persia, and Russia, and what was different? What were the effects of the Mongols on Afro-Eurasia? And what caused the fall of the Mongol Khanates? The first big question, what was similar about Mongol rule in China, Persia, and Russia, and what was different? We saw in the last video how the Mongols had created the largest land-based empire in world history under the leadership of Genghis Khan and then his descendants. But then that empire was overextended. It broke apart into various Mongol states known as Khanates. It's important to recognize how Mongol rule in each of these Khanates was different. So let's start with the Khanate of the Great Khan, which is predominantly China and the Korean Peninsula. The Mongols fit themselves into the traditional dynasty system of China. They took on a dynastic title, and if you know the Chinese dynasty song, do you want to learn Chinese dynasty song? Yuan Mingqing Republic, or Yuan, who are really the Mongols. So the Mongol dynasty in China is known as the Yuan. The Mongols first took control of northern China and then ultimately conquered the southern Song dynasty. It was led by Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan. The Mongols first conquered northern China and then successfully conquered southern China, or the southern Song dynasty as well. They attempted to invade Japan, but ultimately failed due to a series of typhoons that struck, and so Japan remained free from Mongol rule. The Mongols continued to use Chinese traditional bureaucratic structure. They benefited from that vast, complex bureaucracy that the Chinese had established to do all sorts of things, from collecting taxes to building infrastructure. But one of the things that distinguishes the Yuan dynasty from earlier Chinese dynasties is that the Mongols did not utilize that civil service exam system. They didn't use that test, and so Confucianism somewhat falls out of favor during the Mongol Yuan dynasty. Instead, they imported government officials from all over their empire. The scholar bureaucrats were brought in from both the ranks of the Mongols and also places like Persia, and even further. One of the most famous bureaucrats working for the Mongols in China under Kublai Khan was Marco Polo. Marco Polo, who was an Italian merchant and traveler. He traveled all the way from Italy along the Silk Road, eventually working for Kublai Khan in the Mongol bureaucracy in China, and then ultimately returning to Europe and writing about his adventures, increasing European interest in all things East Asian. The Mongols did not fully assimilate, though, with the Chinese. They segregated themselves in some ways. They tried to maintain their own positions of ethnic power over the Chinese. They forbid intermarriage from taking place between Mongols and the Chinese. That's one way that foreign invaders throughout world history have attempted to maintain their own ethnic privilege. But the Mongols were very tolerant overall. They accepted and embraced some of the practices of Buddhism, of Taoism, of ancestor worship. Many Mongols converted to these various religions and philosophies. Remember, the Mongols are very much like chameleons. They adopt and embrace many of the cultural practices of the settled societies they came in contact with. Second, let's focus on the Mongols in Russia, also known as the Khanate of the Golden Horde. The Mongols periodically invaded Russia, but unlike China, the Mongols do not set up a permanent bureaucracy. They do not even, frankly, live amongst the Russian people. Instead, they required Russian princes to collect and ultimately pay tribute to the Mongols. If the Russian princes failed to do so, the Mongols would simply go back and reconquer that area and assert their control and power over Russia once again. One of the things the Mongols did to show their superiority over the Russians is that they would force Russian princes to feed the Mongol horses out of their hats. That is pretty boss. So the Mongols' relationship with the Russians was very different. It was more of a tributary style of relationship. Like in China, however, the Mongols were also very tolerant of both Muslims who lived in southern Russia and then Eastern Orthodox Christians who lived in more northern Russia. Some Mongols even went so far as to convert. We see here St. Peter Tsarevich of the Horde. So we see a Mongol who is being treated as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Finally, I want to talk about the Ilkhanate, or the Mongols and their rule over Persia. The Mongols continued the Persian bureaucratic structure. The Persians, under the Abbasid Caliphate and the Seljuk Turks, had established a bureaucratic structure, and the Mongols, much like they did in China, continued and utilized some of that existing bureaucratic structure. And many of them converted also to the religion of that region, which was Islam. Here we see an image of a Mongol ruler studying the Quran. Eventually, many Mongols simply assimilated into the Persian population. There were no prohibitions on intermarriage, and so after a few generations, there was no real distinction between the Persians and the Mongols. We can place the way in which the Mongols assimilated and integrated into the societies they conquered on a spectrum from least integrated to most integrated. Take a minute to think about which of those three examples that we just studied, the Persians, the Russians, the Chinese, were the Mongols the most integrated and which one was the least integrated. I would argue that Persia was the most integrated. In fact, after a few generations, couldn't really distinguish between the Mongols and the Persians because they had assimilated so fully. The least integrated was Russia. Remember, the Mongols set up a tributary relationship with the Russians and simply forced them to pay tribute, but didn't even live amongst, in many cases, the Russians. And then finally, a blend of both approaches is how the Mongols treated the Chinese. Yes, they did live amongst them and use their existing bureaucratic structures, but they didn't fully embrace Chinese values and traditions. For instance, they didn't use a civil service exam system. Mongol women sure as heck weren't going to practice foot binding. That was not something Mongol women had any interest in doing, so we see the practice of foot binding going out of favor during the Yuan dynasty. And so in some respects, China represents really a middle ground between these two approaches. What were the effects of the Mongols on Afro-Eurasia? Let's look at two plates. Here we have on the left a Turkish blue and white porcelain 15th century plate. And here on the right, we have a Chinese blue and white porcelain plate from the 15th century. What conclusions might we draw about trade based upon these two plates? Well, one thing we could tell was that there was influence here. And in this case, it's the Turks who were influenced by the Chinese doing porcelain a little bit better in the 15th century. One of the reasons why there was this influence is because there were connections between the Middle East and East Asia. And it was really the Mongols who helped facilitate those connections. So the Mongols facilitated Afro-Eurasian trade and communication as new people are drawn into their economies and trade networks. As the Mongols expanded their empire across Eurasia, incorporating almost the entire length of the Silk Road, they facilitated networks of trade. They also ensured protection for merchants, which increased trade as well. And the Mongols are a bit of an enigma because initially they ruthlessly conquered the Chinese, the Persians, the Russians, forcing them to surrender or die. But after that initial conquest, it leads to this period of lasting peace and security. This is known as the Pax Mongolica. So from the period from about mid-13th century, so about 1250, to about roughly 1350, there was this period of peace and security under Mongol rule that leads to increased trade along the Silk Road. The Mongols encouraged significant technological and cultural transfers, many of which start in East Asia and ultimately end up in Europe. For example, gunpowder, first invented by the Chinese in about the 9th century. The Mongols seize on the value of this particular innovation for purposes of military conquest and then spread it along the Silk Road in their conquest of Persia. Paper money and the printing press, two innovations developed by the Chinese. The Mongols will have spread it along the Silk Road. The compass, an important navigational tool developed by the Chinese, spread by the Mongols. And then finally, the adoption of Uyghur script. So the Mongols did not have any form of writing. They were illiterate. They were nomadic peoples. Writing and reading was not really at the top of their to-do list. But after they engaged in this initial military conquest, they recognized the value of writing. Genghis Khan, in fact, wanted to write his own story as a form of propaganda to legitimize his power. A lot of the Mongol history is written by Uyghurs using Uyghur script. Now, one of the things that's cool about Uyghur script is instead of a left to right construction, it actually uses a top to bottom construction. What caused the fall of the Mongol Khanates? As we've talked before about how empires oftentimes fall by both internal and external causes. There were multiple reasons for the fall of the Mongol Khanates. Well, first, you had internal peasant rebellions. For instance, the rise of the Ming dynasty in China. The Yuan, after about a century, were seen as having lost the mandate of heaven, and a new dynasty, the Ming dynasty, rise to power in China. And that actually was started by lower class Chinese peasants. Second, the effects of the plague. Remember, the Mongols had created this network of trade. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, but along with that trade, in the 1300s, came the bubonic plague. Inflation, the incorrect use of paper money. The Mongols simply printed too much paper money, and it caused issues with their economy. It's one thing to have an innovation like paper money, it's another thing to be able to use it correctly. Next, I want to go back to China and talk about what comes about in China with the collapse of the Yuan dynasty, with the collapse of the Mongols, and the rise of the next dynasty, which are the Ming. So how does the Ming dynasty seek to restore order in China? So the Yuan dynasty is going to collapse. They're going to be overthrown by an internal rebellion. The Ming dynasty will assert its power, and it will look to the past. It does what China always seems to do, which is embrace those traditional state-building techniques that have worked for so long in China. In the mid-1300s, the Ming begins to re-embrace the values of Confucianism. It reestablishes the civil service exam system. It reasserts that tribute system requiring neighbors to come and recognize Chinese superiority in order to gain a trade relationship. The Ming bring back these traditions, including Neo-Confucianism, the civil service exam system, and the tribute system. One of the things that the Ming dynasty does is it starts to build up its naval power and its maritime technology. They build a number of huge ships called junk boats, and they send these ships out under the leadership of an admiral named Zheng He. Now, Zheng He, a very fascinating figure in history. He was a Ming eunuch. So if you don't know what a eunuch is, you should do some research on Google. This is about all I'll give to you. And he happened to be Muslim as well. And he was sent on these expeditions in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in East Africa, and it results in a significant amount of technological and cultural transfers, both from the Chinese to the people of this Indian Ocean basin, but also in return from people of the Indian Ocean basin back to the Chinese. You can see here the size of Zheng He's boats, and he had about 300 of these ships versus Christopher Columbus's ships. Columbus reached the Americas with just 3 of these boats. Certainly you can make the case that the Chinese could have reached the Americas since they had 300 of these ships. And this takes place in the early 1400s. The Ming dynasty decides to end those treasure voyages, and that is a critical turning point, you can argue, in Chinese history, because otherwise the Chinese would have had the maritime technology, certainly, to have reached the Americas and done some of the exploration and maritime conquest that the Europeans later will do in the 16th and 17th centuries. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching these 2 videos on the Mongols: how are the Mongols and other pastoral nomadic societies influenced by their environment? What were the social and cultural characteristics of the Mongols and other pastoral nomadic societies? How did the Mongols build the largest land-based empire in world history? What was similar about Mongol rule in China, Persia, and Russia, and what was different? What were the effects of the Mongols on Afro-Eurasia? And what caused the fall of the Mongol Khanates? As always, thanks for watching.